My first memories are sort of going over to where she was staying and having coffee with her. And we have this sort of coffee ceremony in Ethiopia where you sort of burn incense and you know, and it takes ages and it's basically the time that people have to chat. And these stories would just sort of bubble up. She would tell a story and it would just kind of live, even though you couldn't understand all the words. You kind of knew, you had a feel. It was the language. When I started translating it in my head, I felt that it had a kind of vividness and poetry to it. That was the kind of where I began. That was the thing that I wanted to translate. It wasn't necessarily I wanted to say anything about Ethiopia, although that came later. It was to try and catch that sense of story and language. My grandmother she was born nearly 100 years ago, or yeah, it would be 100 years ago this year, I think. She lived for nearly 100 years. And what happened to her happened to millions of girls in Ethiopia. She was married off very young. It was organised for her. I guess what is also true of millions of girls like her in Ethiopia is history happened to them in some fairly extraordinary ways, and what I tell or try to tell is how an ordinary person lives in history, which is the thing that's not told very much. It's how a person lives through feudal empire, fascist invasion, revolution, civil war, and copes with it, and personally the sort of imprisonment of her husband, and survives it and copes with it, and the resources that we find, and where the places where those resources come from, and the ways in which a kind of resilience, I guess. This is a story of an ordinary person, I think. A very ordinary person thrust into kind of quite extraordinary circumstances, and just the way in which he survived. It's very easy to assume, I don't know if other people find this, because you know somebody or because you grew up in a country, it's very easy to assume you know. And it's like sort of doing a scientific experiment and having the result before you've begun. And actually, if you listen really hard, you realise that you don't know. You realise that things are stranger and more specific than you've given them credit for. One of my ambitions with this book was to take a country and a person and a country and just immerse the reader in them with very few handholds, very few explanation, in the way that you would suddenly be immersed in a book about, 1950s London, or the Outer Hebrides, or something, where it was just kind of, you just go straight in and say, this is a place and a person, utterly on their own terms. And that was both a challenge and quite thrilling, because I had to sort of inhabit it completely too. I just wanted the reader to be there, in a country and in a place and in a time and in a consciousness, to the extent that I could possibly produce that.